Hi guys, this is our AP US video. Today we're going to be talking about Dwight D. Eisenhower, the 34th president, how he got elected president, and what set him apart from some of his predecessors. I know this has been a very tough week for everybody, and I know this definitely is a time of reflection about what we've lost. But I hope to get started again with our videos. You can watch this at your leisure this weekend. Also, a little update with the AP test. The AP test is going to be a take-home test. The dates have not been announced yet. It will be an abbreviated version of the test. So what we're going to do is I'm still going to be posting the review assignment so we can recap all the stuff that you did in 9th and 10th grade. You're going to send that to me on Jupiter Grades. Your first assignment is due on Monday, and then after that I'll post an additional assignment. And then we'll go forward from there. I'll keep giving you updates as as I find out information. Then I will tell all you guys. All right. So we left off in the last video. President Truman was very unpopular, 22% approval rating. I always call it the way the country was feeling in 1952. It was definite Truman fatigue. Also fatigue with the Democratic Party in general. After they had been in power for 20 years, that's a very, very long streak for one political party to be in power. The Korean War was dragging on, no end in sight. There was all these allegations of corruption, the Truman administration, and the Republicans kept banging the drum about communist infiltration in government. Remember, this is the height of the Red Scare, the height of Joe McCarthy's influence. So there are a lot of people out there who believe that the Democrats had been soft on communism. Remember, they had lost China. We had Alger Hiss and the Rosenbergs. We had all these cases of communist, well, not all of them, but there were a few cases of communist espionage, which just exacerbated the hysteria about communist infiltration in our government. So conditions were ripe for a change in party. Now, technically, excuse me, President Truman was eligible to run for another term. The 22nd Amendment, which had been passed in 1951, the year before, which had limited a president to 2 terms, did not apply to whoever happened to be president at the time the amendment was passed. So that happened to be Truman. So Truman could have run for a second, well, I guess it would be a 3rd term, but he chose not to do that. So the Democrats searched for months and months for an acceptable alternative. They had a very hard time finding one, and then finally they came up with the governor of Illinois, a man named Adlai Stevenson. Now, Adlai Stevenson is not a well-known name today, except those of you from the Bronx. There's a high school named after him. But Adlai Stevenson was a beloved figure among liberals of the 1950s. Now, the 1950s was generally rightly not considered a time of liberalism. So a lot of liberals, this was not the New Deal era. So a lot of liberals were searching for a hero in many ways, somebody who, kind of epitomized to them the values that progressivism involved. And for them, that man was Adlai Stevenson. He was an intellectual. They used to call him, he was bald too, so they called him an egghead, mocking his baldness, but also mocking the fact that he was just kind of a head in the clouds intellectual, or at least that was the idea. And Adlai Stevenson, never completely, to some, being an intellectual is a good thing, that you're somebody you want in a president, but for others, it's not. Remember, there's a strong anti-intellectual strain in American politics. There always has been. And the fact that Adlai Stevenson was seen as so smart actually hurt him politically. He was also divorced, and it's the first national candidate to have been divorced. He was married to the Board and Cheese heiress. He definitely had a lot of money. I think he got some money in the divorce settlement. He gave these lofty speeches, sometimes went over a lot of people's heads. In fact, somebody once said to him, well, you have the thinking man's vote. But he responded, yes, but I need a majority. Which kind of encapsulates right there the problems that Adlai Stevenson had in the 1952 election. Now, the Republican Party was divided. It was divided between Robert Taft, who was the candidate of conservative Republicans. He was an icon for conservative Republicans. My grandfather, who was a conservative Republican, loved Robert Taft. The other candidate was America's greatest hero, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower had won the Second World War, basically. He was the architect of D-Day, the man who came up with the strategy that eventually resulted in Allied victory in Europe in 1945. So Dwight D. Eisenhower was an iconic figure in American life. He had resisted getting into politics for a very long time. He even resisted saying whether he was a Democrat or a Republican. Finally, he said he was a Republican. So Eisenhower and Taft were fighting it out for the nomination. It was, at least to me, it's always a little surprising just how close the race was, considering how iconic Eisenhower was. But Eisenhower wound up winning the nomination. Eisenhower was definitely a moderate Republican. Eisenhower once said about himself, I'm conservative when it comes to money, I'm liberal when it comes to people. Even though, I don't know about the liberal when it comes to people part, Eisenhower actually was not a fan of civil rights, not a racist, I don't think, but someone who is just conservative by nature and was really resistant to big social change, particularly his opposition to integrating the military in 1948, which President Truman had done. Now, because he was seen as a moderate, and he was old, he was in his 60s, older, Eisenhower decided to pick a young right-winger to be his running mate. He picked the 39-year-old senator from California, Richard Nixon. You might have heard that name. Nixon actually had gotten pretty famous a few years earlier because he was the one who was responsible for exposing Alger Hiss as a communist spy. And Nixon had this reputation, mostly deserved, as basically a red baiter, someone who was just going around accusing Democrats of being either soft on communists or complicit in communism. He became the attack dog in the Republican campaign. While Eisenhower stayed above the fray, Nixon was the one who went after the Democrats. He said, quote, Adlai the Appeaser got his PhD from Dean Acheson, that's Truman's Secretary of State's College of Cowardly Communist Containment. Some alliteration there, and also it just tells you like a lot of what you need to know about how Nixon approached his campaign. Now, Eisenhower's campaign slogan was "I like Ike." Ike had been a childhood nickname of Eisenhower's that stuck with him to adulthood, and it rhymed, so it made a great political slogan in the campaign. Now, I don't know how this is going to work. I'm going to play you on my computer, my other computer, Eisenhower, a commercial for Eisenhower that used this I like Ike theme to try to win Eisenhower votes.
Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We don't want John or Dean or Harry, let's do that big job right. Let's get in step with the guy that's up, get in step with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We got to get where we are going. Travel day and night for president. Never go the other way. We'll all go with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike. Everybody likes Ike for president. Hang up the banner, beat the drum. We'll take Ike to Washington. We'll take Ike to Washington.
Now is the time for all good Americans to come to the aid of their country.
So there we go. I like Ike. Eisenhower had a very grandfatherly, down-to-earth manner. And the thing is that was something that was very appealing to a lot of voters who were I just think wanted, a low-key but heroic figure leading the country. He also promised to end the Korean War. He said, I will go to Korea personally to negotiate an end to the Korean War. So Nixon, if we had in class, I usually show you a clip. I might post the clip on my website. Nixon got into some trouble in the 52 campaign because he was accused of keeping an $18,000 slush fund that had been set up for him by corporate executives to kind of use for his expenses, which sounds very shady. So Nixon decided to give a speech on television defending himself. And in this speech, he just read out all this money that he had, all the money that he owed. And he said, the only gift I've ever gotten from anyone was a Cocker Spaniel dog named Checkers. And I'm keeping Checkers. And this speech, known as the Checkers speech, became one of the most important speeches in American political history because it was, I think, the first time TV, and because it was a televised speech, the whole country was watching. It was the first time TV was used in this way. Politically. And it saved Nixon. Eisenhower said, you better come out as clean as a hound's tooth. He told him before that he gave the speech. And then when he did give the speech, hundreds of thousands of telegrams flooded the Republican Party headquarters asking Eisenhower to keep Nixon on the ticket. And it saved Nixon's spot on the ticket and saved Nixon's political career. And we know ultimately where that led. It led into a lot of different directions for sure. So Eisenhower ultimately, Stevenson was trying to remind voters of, trying to wave, Herbert Hoover, which Democrats had done for the 20 years, but it didn't work this time. Eisenhower won a landslide election victory. He won the electoral vote 442 to 89 for Stevenson. So that's a pretty big landslide. He won 55% of the popular vote, so it was a solid victory. Eisenhower cracked the Democratic South, and the Republicans also won control over Congress too. At least, but they didn't hold it for long. I think they only held it for 2 years. Now, Eisenhower, for people who were alive in the 1950s, a lot of people barely even knew Eisenhower was there. He always gave this image of being so laid back, he was almost seemed lazy. He was often seen playing golf. They once said about Eisenhower, he reigned but did not rule, saying that you knew he was president, but he really wasn't doing much of anything. But I read a book about Eisenhower a few years ago, and they called Eisenhower's presidency the hidden hand presidency. Now, what they mean by that is that he didn't look like he was actually doing much, but behind the scenes, Eisenhower was very shrewd politically, and he actually was running the show. And I think that's pretty correct. After Eisenhower's presidency, a lot of people were like, well, what was that all about? He didn't really do much of anything. But as time has gone on, historians have generally seen Eisenhower was actually a very effective president, just not someone who was more active, like behind the scenes, and was very involved in running the country that way. Now, remember we talked about Eisenhower being a moderate Republican. Now, Eisenhower embraced something called modern Republicanism. So, modern Republicanism was basically accepting the New Deal, accepting the idea that the government does have a role to play in people's lives, but not being sympathetic to the idea of actually expanding government. Even though he did on several occasions do that. He expanded Social Security, which is a big deal. The Democrats created that, of course. He also raised the minimum wage. He signed the Interstate Highway Act, and that it's hard to overstate just how important the Interstate Highway Act was. It basically linked every part of the continental United States to every other part of the continental United States. It took decades to finish, but it basically, revolutionized this country. And Eisenhower was responsible for that. 41,000 miles of highway. It also accelerated suburbanization, the dependence on the car, the move to the Sun Belt, and all the cultural changes that were taking place already after the Second World War, but were exacerbated or accelerated by the Interstate Highway Act being passed. He did end the Korean War. He did go to Korea after the 1952 election. He threatened the use of nuclear weapons on the communists if they didn't sign an armistice. And in 1953, an armistice was signed, a ceasefire, which is still in effect to this day. Remember, the Korean War never officially ended. The ceasefire truce signed in 1953 is actually what's still in effect to this day. All right, guys. In our next video, we're going to talk about Eisenhower's foreign policy and also the way Eisenhower took on or did not take on Joe McCarthy in the 1950s. All right, guys. Later.